In lieu of a written post, I decided that posting a video and talking about how my personal experiences relate to the story that Marjane told in her first half of the graphic novel Persepolis would be more of a benefit to the class than me trying to write this up. I like the sound of my own voice, and I miss the classroom setting sometimes, especially when it comes to discussing literature. So I'm going to dive right in and say that while I appreciated having the story focused on the more secular narratives or perspectives of the Iranian Revolution, I think that it is right, as it's stated in the introduction and stated in the video we watched on Crash Course, that there seems to be a focus on telling the story of the Iranian Revolution as a focus on religious fundamentalism. And while that is true to an extent, there were more secular voices, communists, like the narrator's parents, that took part in the revolution and called for the abdication of the Shah. And there was hope that a more secular form of government could take place, one less corrupt and one less pigeonholed by Western powers into doing whatever they wish. But instead of diving into politics, I'm going to focus on the religious aspects of the story, especially Marjan's relation of her deep, abiding spirituality and the course that takes throughout her life. I I resonated with the quote on page 6 where she said, "I didn't really know what to think about the veil. Deep down, I was very religious. But as a family, we were very modern and avant-garde." And I had a similar experience growing up. My father was a born-again Christian. He was raised in a born-again Christian home, a focus on evangelicalism, outreach to neighbors, living a good testimony to the people around him. Whereas my mother was saved by a televangelist in the late 70s, early 80s, and she was a latecomer to the more fundamentalist view of Christianity. She came from a very educated upper middle class family. Her parents were both teachers. My grandfather was the head of the physics department up at UMD. And so my mother had these sensibilities and this sense of humor where she was much more permissive than I think my father would have been. She let us read Harry Potter. She let us watch movies as long as she had watched them first. She did a lot of things that my other evangelical friends didn't allow. I went to a Christian school starting in third grade where I graduated. Before that, I was homeschooled. And for my whole life, I was raised in the Assemblies of God Church, a very fundamentalist church that reads the Bible literally. But I had this juxtaposed thing in my family where my father was very earnest and evangelical in his outlook, while my mother was more pragmatic. My father would lead me through the sinner's prayer when I was 5, and I know my mother laughed at that kind of manufactured conversion. She said he got to you quick. He sneaked up on you with the sinner's prayer when you were younger. He wanted to make sure you were assured of a place in heaven. So I had this juxtaposition of my father's very earnest, down home religion, and my mother's more intellectual, adult spirituality, something she came to later in life. And I could really relate with Marjan's experience. On page 9, she says, "I wanted to be justice, love, and the wrath of God all in one." And that really came to a head to me for me when I was 15. I believed I was called into the ministry, and I actually attended Bible college for a few months after high school before ultimately leaving the faith. But I could relate to her early questioning of the faith, her being drawn away from the calling of a prophet to a more scientific view of the world or a more materialist view of the world. On page 13, I think she really effectively translated that to a metaphor by likening Marx's image to the classical depiction of God in monotheistic religions, their bearded faces being similar, except Marx is more curly. And I remember having that early on, even though I would have called myself a born-again Christian as a child, and I had religious experiences like a calling into ministry and a salvation experience at 13. I also remember when I was in 6th grade, having my teacher was telling us that all of the teachings of evolution, all of these striving by secular scientists to try to explain the origins of life on this planet, were just an attempt to not be held accountable to God. That's the reason that the evolution narrative had taken hold, is because they didn't want to be accountable to God. I remember even thinking at the time and raising my hand saying, so you're saying that all the scientists got together and they all agreed that they should lie about evolution to everybody, and that's the only reason they have these theories is because they don't want to be accountable to God in eternity? And it didn't add up to me. And those questions lingered. And I like in how page 17, when she dives deeper into the dialectic, into Marx's teaching, God departs from her. She loses that close relationship. And that really resonated with me, because I had this on again, off again relationship with God growing up, where one moment I'd be seeing Jesus crucified and feeling horrible about my sins, and another time I would just be kind of apathetic about spiritual things. Page 25, God reappears and asks, "What are you doing?" when she starts soaking herself in a bathtub to recreate the torture that her grandfather was put through when he was put in a watery cell. And that sort of self-flagellation, that very religious, that effort to try to grow, to get yourself closer to the real, raw experience of something, that really resonated with me. I remember watching The Passion of the Christ at 4:30 a.m. one morning when I was a child, and just putting myself through that as an 11-year-old to try to atone for my perceived sins and try to get that close relationship with God again. And in page 53, Marjane kind of comes back to the faith from Marxism. I didn't know what justice was. Now that the revolution was finally over once and for all, I abandoned the dialectic materialism of my comic strips. The only place I felt safe was in the arms of my friend. And I remember having that when I was 17, the faith became very important to me. God's love became very important to me. It was the basis of my life, and I was planning to have a career preaching that message to others. But life happened. I went through a house fire. I had several things change in my life. I had the questions that were resonating in my head about evolution and a scientific explanation for the world came to a head when Bill Nye and Ken Ham debated in 2014. And I was left wondering about creationism again, and that eventually took me down the path of watching other people debate, like Christopher Hitchens, and I kind of got caught up in the tail end of that new atheist movement that came out. I left the church, left Bible school, and I really can resonate with the what Marjane relates on page 70 after her uncle Anush is killed. "Shut up, you. Get out of my life. I never want to see you again. Get out." And I had those similar experiences with God where I hadn't quite let go of his existence as being real, and I had this very personal rejection and disdain for him as a concept. And I tried my very best to banish the very idea of God out of my life as quickly as I could, and reject all of the things I'd been raised with. And when Marjane relates that on page 71, "And so I was lost, without bearings, what could be worse than that?" I can relate to that. It really resonated with me when I was 20 years old and I had just left the whole structure of belief I was raised in, my future career, my friends. I just felt rudderless and without purpose. And I'm excited to finish the second half of the story. We ended with a kind of cliffhanger ending with Marjane joining in the war against Iraq, potentially enlisting. I'm very interested to read about that, and I'm interested to see what her religious journey will turn out to be in the second half of the book as we move into that next week.